Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. That's from the Truman Show, and that's because all of us are in very different places today. Deputy Prime Minister, Mr. Heng Swee Keat, Professor Houston Kwa, thank you very much for the privilege of hosting this session with the amazing Richard Sandor, who is unable to be with us today. My name is Emmanuel Daniel. I am the founder of The Asian Banker out of Singapore, which is today branded as Tab Global because we are global. And I'm here today in Algeria, and Professor Sandor is in Chicago. And he asked me to coordinate this session with him, primarily because I've had the same conversations with him over a number of years. We've had an amazing friendship, and I've worked with him on other meetings before. So I think between the two of us, we hope to be useful to the rest of you. The interesting thing about Algeria is that I'm looking right out to the Algiers Botanical Gardens. I'm very proud of the botanical gardens we have in Singapore, but Algeria has a formidable one, which is more French than it is English. And Professor Sandor is in Chicago. And the interesting thing about economists coming out of Chicago, if you stretch a little deeper, you'll find that almost all of them have their feet on the ground. They have dirt in their hand. Someone in the family had worked in soybean and pork belly and all of these industries and tried to make markets out of them. And all of the domination that the Chicago economists have on the rest of us in developing markets, it comes from that feel of the ground. And that's why I totally admire what Professor Sandor had achieved in climate, in voluntary carbon pricing markets, but also at a personal level, the thinking that he puts through the creation of these markets, which is what we want to benefit from today. Now, I highly recommend that all of you who are participants to this conference read the paper that he has submitted to the Singapore Economics Review. I've read the paper, and that's also why he asked me to have this session with him. It tells the story of how he created markets. And the conversation that we want to have today is both about the climate change, capital markets, as I call it, and also markets in general. Singapore is going through an interesting phase where its traditional markets are beleaguered. The markets around Singapore are now larger, far more liquid, and more interesting. But at the same time, Singapore is now home to a number of new market initiatives. Among my friends are the founders of Air Carbon Exchange, AgriDance, which is trying to build markets from traders in rubber and so on from the ground up. So I hope that this conversation will be valuable on a more broader basis. So Richard, let's go. Let's hit the ground running. Let me start by asking you to reflect a little bit on the points that you had raised, right, in your paper, how you had described the creation of the Chicago Climate Exchange, the elements that went into it. So off the top of your mind, what would you like to highlight for our audience today?
I want to thank Professor Kwa, the staff of the Singapore Economic Review, and the conference organizers for allowing me to do this discussion by video rather than in person. A special shout out to my dear friend Emmanuel Daniel and Tab for facilitating this. I am sorry that I can't be there in person, but I hope that this interview, along with the slides and article, will give you a sense of what we're trying to accomplish. Well, the important thing is to describe what the Chicago Climate Exchange was and to then answer relevant questions about it. The Chicago Climate Exchange was a voluntary but legally binding cap and trade program involving all 6 greenhouse gases. The natural question among many that one would ask, why in the world would a company take on a legally binding commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over a 7-year period and do it with no government mandate to do so? That's the fundamental question.
The creation of something out of nothing.
Out of nothing, and the description of inventive activity as a response to latent or overt demand, and in this case was identifying a latent demand that would respond in a commercial venture. And that question is answered by a number of factors. This exchange grew to 400 members. It had an emission baseline, a third of Europe. It contained 17% of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It had DuPont, American Electric Power, the largest coal-fired facility. It had International Paper, and all of those, and Ford Motor Company, and Manitoba Hydro, and ultimately Intel, and IBM, and Monsanto, and every major brand name. And how, in fact, what were they motivated? What got them together? Club effects. And we identified what we called a mutual endowment, a sense of esprit de corps that people had with a common purpose that had commercial logic, but yet driven by social objectives. People wanted to be a member of that club. In a subcategory, they thought in some cases that regulation was inevitable. So Ford Motor Company wanted to learn in Detroit principles that could be applied in Marseille or Dusseldorf to comply with the European ETS, which was coming. In some instances, people would naturally cut emissions and would agree if they felt that they could make those cuts and even go further and therefore sell their commitments in a cap and trade system. There were others who knew that they might have to buy in the healthcare sector and other areas, but they felt, how could they be Abbott or Baxter Labs and not be involved in something that might have planetary health? People like the city of Chicago, where the mayor believed in parks and setting them up and planting tulips on Michigan Avenue and wanted more public parks. States like New Mexico that had a long tradition. Cities like Oakland, California, the then mayor Jerry Brown, who became governor, wanted to find the easy solutions in the municipally owned buildings and traffic lights that could be set to minimize gas emissions, etc. So it was a matter of public purpose, profit, and in some instances, by including the more exotic gases, we got the Intels and the IBM to do it, but they didn't necessarily sell because of what Netsch calls the endowment effect. They wanted to participate and cut, but wanted to do it without necessarily monetizing. So all in all, the other key factors was the bringing in of a self-regulatory organization, the NASD, that basically was rebranded by Mary Shapiro to do financial audits. They were going into companies like Ford Motor Company, looking at all of their fuels, converting them, and the robustness of it. So the independent regulation by FINRA, that rebranded organization, plus peer review and penalties. So it was micro incentives, micro penalties, macro objectives, and a club effect, which we call a mutual endowment, sense of joining with your fellow corporates engaged in a social objective.
So there was a motivation for self-preservation, and there's a motivation for public good.
One other thing that I think was a joke that we had among the members were an old expression that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
Well said. Now, then comes the creation of the market itself, the creation of the pricing mechanism, the creation of the liquidity mechanism, the creation of the price discovery ecosystem, right? So you're breathing life into a market. Walk us through that.
Yeah, well, markets are complex organizations that are driven by economics, law, and sociology, psychology. I get a call once a week from somebody says, oh, I have an idea. Can I start a cannabis market, or can I start a market in something else? And they think it's just designing a matching engine, which couldn't be further from the truth. Number one, you need an enabling legislation. In our case, it was an enabling mechanism that we called the Chicago Accord, which was a document setting out the 9 principles of purpose. That had to be developed by consensus through 4 groups: paper, manufacturing, agriculture, et cetera, coming together. Then, of course, there is the regulatory part. So how do you monitor? How do you verify? How do you have dispute resolution? How do you fine? How do you create that? So that's the second version. The third is to set up the institution. What is the nature of governance? What is the nation of committees? What is their relationship to the board of directors? Then the fourth of the 4 fields is the microeconomics of designing the specific contract terms of what you're going to trade and how you define it. So if you have enabling legislation, regulation, the nature of the institution, and the contract, it becomes the complex interaction. Then, of course, you have to educate the lawyers, the accountants, the academics, the public, the regulators as to your purpose. Then you have to go to the universities, educate the professors. Then you have to educate the students. Then there are societies of American environmental journalists. You have to go to their convention. You have to describe what a market is and how it differs from subsidies and taxes and demand and control. All in all, in my experience over the last 50 years, it takes 10 to 20 years to develop a market. 0 to 2 is like a toddler. 2 to 5 is like a young school-age kid. 5 to 10 is a young adult, and 10 to 20 is a mature market. And it doesn't much matter if you're talking about mortgage-backed securities, the personal telephone, aircraft. Financial and industrial inventive activity is generally a generational activity, and it cannot be started by 11 tech guys in a room with a system of computers. That is not what a market is.
Now, one of the big difference between a voluntary carbon credit market and a securities market is that the application of the valuations created in the market are for two different things. One is for profit, the other is for social good. The Europeans seem to have perfected the voluntary carbon market in one reason being that they gave a floor price to their market. So they gave a benchmark valuation which the market needed to operate in order for it to be meaningful. Whereas in the original market that you created, there was no floor price. And how effective do you think the US market was relative to the Europeans? And how are the other markets evolving in price discovery?
Well, I think they were both effective. The primary driver in environmental markets was acid rain. And in the acid rain program,
That was a story.
it was, we cut 90% emissions, and it achieved exactly, and to the audience, it's very important to understand when you start a market for public goods, the job is to put yourself out of business. You're supposed to make yourself redundant. And if you do that, you've succeeded. And that's a very hard concept to put into action. Very easy to believe, but hard to do it if it's your own business. There's a sense of pride. The SO2 program did it by giving out free allowances. The Europeans sell the allowances, floors, caps. It's very important, and very important for this audience, because the punchline of this meeting, it is my unambiguous belief that a voluntary ASEAN climate exchange is something that there is a clarion call for economists, public policy makers, industrialists in this 600 million people market to be a light unto other nations in Asia, that ASEAN can do it. But these are all, and I mention that because the technical ways you design a market have to fit the sociology and politics of the region you're dealing with. So what might be right for California's cap and trade might not be right for Europe. And what might be right for Europe might not fit China at all. And what fits China at all might not fit ASEAN. It is why we developed a relationship in China, why we started the European exchanges, was our belief was that markets have sociological and political dimensions. And they unlike an iPhone, But more like any other industrial product, manufacturers sometimes get very ugly lessons that they're trying to sell an American product into a market with non-American consumers. One has to think of markets in the same way. They have to be indigenous to the populations as well as the social goals. Some people can take rapid caps declining. Some people need slower ones.
You're just talking right into my next question, which is, you've described how you created the US market, but you were also instrumental in the creation of the Chinese ETS, the Indonesian ETS, and elsewhere. How were these different from what you needed to create, what you created in the US? And from what I'm reading right now, and in fact in China, I'm actually quite familiar with how the ETS is going. There are integrity issues in there. Especially in the early days of creating the market mechanism, especially if it's a top-down approach, because everybody's like trying to second guess the creator, the state, or the intentions of the creator. But tell us all about what your experience has been in China and in other markets where you've tried to replicate the cap and trade model.
Well, in China, one had to convince, of course, the government, because the nature of the Chinese economy, as you well know, is a command and control with free enterprise. And so we had to convince those people in the central bank. So we met with the head of the central bank. We met with the 5-year planning agency. We started with very small, tiny steps because it wasn't familiar with public goods the way US companies like SO2, they didn't know what property rights. We began, ultimately, there were 7 other exchanges that followed. The economic base had to be built. So that's a very different set of dynamics. They wanted to start with a carbon intensity program as opposed to absolute. That was easier to attain, but they have to go to an absolute cap as opposed to a carbon intensity. But the question never is, where does the journey begin and where does the journey end? It is, what is the optimum path for any given geography, nation, or group of nations? And for that reason, Emmanuel, we believed that the early efforts, and we said it in '92 at the Rio summit, it would become a plurilateral. There would not be a centralized one-size-fits-all, that it would follow the grain trade or the cotton trade. In cotton, you had Egyptian markets, you had Mumbai as a major center, you had Winterthur, you had Liverpool, you had New Orleans. They ultimately came up with worldwide standards, and there was never a worldwide market. The same for wheat. And it was our belief, and it still is, there'll be a North American, there'll be a European, there'll be a Chinese, an Indian, an ASEAN, a Japanese market, that maybe there'd be 5 or 6 trading blocks, and then they would be linked by certain common standards, so arbitrage would create a uniform world price, but based on averages in different jurisdictions.
What is the role of the state in this whole process? And I ask this because, around the world, the state defines for itself its own roles in the creation of markets and bringing life to it. And what's your experience been? And what do you wish maybe in the US? And I'm actually hinting to a point that you made in your paper where you said you wish that certain legislations had gone through in the US and it didn't?
Well, I think, again, it depends on the character. In the United States, which I think arguably have the best regulated and most transparent securities and commodities markets in the world. So if that's the case, and also in the UK and the jurisdiction, the wheat market started in 1848, and the first futures was wheat. A group of merchants got together and decided, because we were exporting wheat to the Crimea for the Crimean War, they had to have a protein level, infestation, water content, etc. They came up with what you might say were crude generations, given that there were not the ways to measure that in those days. Those standards were eventually ratified by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The securities trading in 1792, the New York Stock Exchange, same thing happened, and then the SEC was created. So I think the balance is to let the private sector come to consensus and then have a regulatory authority be there to prevent any abuses that might occur. But the inventive part of the cycle and the early applications should be worked out so they have commercial logic. Once that commercial logic is there and can be self-sustaining, regulation becomes critical so that the system has belief, integrity, bad actors are punished, and incentives are aligned for people to do the right thing. It's all to get to the ultimate sense of a market, and that is price, because price affects behavior. If it's too high, it limits it. If it's too low, so, it's a question of finding that piece of information that will affect the supply and demand in such a way to meet either the physical food needs, or in the case of environmental, that bliss point that reduces emissions at the least possible cost over a predetermined point of time.
Here's a markets question, conceptual question, and this exists in the US more than any other country in the world. The opportunity to leverage between two regulators, arbitrage between two regulators. You got the SEC on one end, and you got the CFTC on the other. And we see this today with cryptocurrencies, how the SEC wants to treat it as a security, and the CFTC would be happy to take it on as a commodity. This kind of arbitrage between regulators. Talk us through in the creation of markets, in the building of self-interest in creating a tradable security. How would you describe this arbitrage that exists in the US?
Well, I think 50 years ago to almost the month, I was involved in developing the legislation to create the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And it was, prior to that, defined only to physical commodities. And we changed the definition to intangible, and most importantly, we created exclusive jurisdiction for the CFTC. The SEC's principal job is customer protection, okay? The CFTC's job is to create an efficient industrial mechanism to transfer price risk. And the separation of those two is critical. If it creates an arbitrage, so be it. But they are very different agencies with very different purposes. And the allocation of who gets what is very important because they have different jobs. The SEC is to protect somebody against buying a share in a scam company. And the idea of the CFTC is to provide a mechanism for banks to hedge interest rate risk and farmers to get price insurance for their crops. So they cannot be viewed in the same light. And those who would suggest that they should be viewed as one entity, I think need to differentiate between form and function because they're both regulatory agencies. It is a mistake to assume their objectives are identical.
For oncoming assets, like digital assets, this is a point that we could drill deeper on, ad infinitum. But for the sake of completeness, one last question. What are you most afraid of if there's a Trump administration that comes into power? How would the agenda change for the US on voluntary carbon trading and the whole climate agenda?
I think it's not political. The program for SO2 was born under George H.W. Bush. The program to legislate a cap and trade was killed by the Democrats in 2010. By a senator after the bill having passed in the House killed it with a 60 Senate majority. So the two examples we have, the market was killed by the Democrats and enabled by the Republicans. Having said that, this is a ground-up economy. Seatbelts came from local initiatives. Markets for clean air are coming from ambient pollutants in cities and states. Regions like the Northeast and California, inevitably, the demand for environment is a local issue very often. And I believe the fact that the United States is a federal republic means there will be a continuation of whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. There is an inexorable, inevitable trend among the technology providers, the young people, that environment is a challenge and it will go on independent of the political process.
Richard, this is all time we have today for this amazing conversation. And I'll say this, that for all the things that the rest of the world is concerned about the US right now, to be able to interact with someone like you, an entrepreneur, a visionary, a creator of markets, is one of the most refreshing reminders of the strength of the US in itself. And to say that it's from the ground up, that's the defining feature of the US as a creator and innovator in finance. So thank you very much for this conversation.
Let me put one last punctuation point. There is an enormous opportunity in the ground up to create a voluntary ASEAN climate exchange, ASEAN climate exchange. This has many nations with many cultures, languages, and difference. And I unambiguously believe that the ASEAN countries can build a ground-up market that will enlighten the rest of Asia and Europe and Africa and South America and provide a light to the rest of the world. Thank you to the audience. A special thank you to the Deputy Prime Minister. Sorry I can't be with you today, but we'll see you on my next trip to Singapore.
And thank you all, and don't forget to read
Thank
the
you
report.
all.